Good evening, everyone. Nice to have you here. Good afternoon, in case you're in an area where it's in the afternoon. Today, we're going to talk about something different. But before we do, I'd just like to make a quick announcement. Next week, when we talk about Assyrian Martyrs Day, we're going to live stream it. I'm going to pre-record what I'm saying for Martyrs Day, and then Pierre and Sarah are going to be discussing Martyrs Day from their perspective. So that should be a very interesting lecture. So please tune in. That's the 7th of August, of course, which is Assyrian Martyrs Day. And that's going to be at 7 p.m., like every Thursday. So today we're going to talk about two very preeminent Assyriologists or historians on Assyria. When you see that many people have written about Assyria, two very unique personalities stand out. In 1923, A.T. Olmstead wrote one of the preeminent books on Assyria, A History of Assyria. And then in 1984, Saggs came out with his book, The Might That Was Assyria. And these two really transformed Assyrian studies. Why so? We're going to go over all of these issues. But before we do, I want to ask Sarah and Pierre, given that these authors are different than the others, we studied, of course, how the Bible viewed the Assyrians. We studied how classical authors, Greek and Roman authors, viewed Assyrian history. In reading Saggs and in knowing about Saggs and Olmstead earlier, Sarah, how would you do things differently, or what is your challenge in viewing the works of authors like Saggs and Olmstead?
Thank you for the question. The thing, both of the scholars, I feel like, in a way, they are respectable. They do provide like great study of ancient Assyria, and they provide good information for Assyria to learn about their ancestral past. I can't deny that. Olmsted mentioned in his work that he kind of wished to bring Assyria to life, not as part of the background of the Bible or earlier interpretations, but as its own really like independent historical entity, which I kind of feel helped um, modern Assyrians engage with their past without having like a predominant biased lens, since it shows Assyria in a new light. But yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, these authors still kind of follow a pattern. Assyrian voices are largely silenced beyond antiquity, but I guess they both offer us a way to doing more research. I know that Saggs mentioned that the destruction of the empire did not really necessarily wipe out its populations, and mentioned that really the Assyrian people reminisced on their lands and kind of rebuilded villages. And he kind of essentially brought Christians into the and so on. Um, but again, these scholarly statements can surely help modern Assyrians today legitimize themselves. But I feel like Olmsted, on the other hand, probably plays into the silence more about what happened to Assyrians post-empire, and really kind of reflects the views I've mentioned here. Was
Sarah, you're kind of cutting out. I don't know if Pierre, you're
really?
picking up.
Okay,
No,
I
it's
probably
cutting out
have
for me as well, Robert.
Can you hear me?
I can
Yeah,
hear
but
you,
it's
but it's
very
kind of like,
choppy.
yeah, choppy.
Okay.
That's the word.
Come back
Choppy.
to me.
Okay.
Come back to me.
All right, Pierre. Why don't you just give me your reflections on these authors, particularly from the viewpoint of a modern Assyrian? How do you see the works done by Olmstead and Saggs?
Well, let's take these authors into context. Olmsted was at University of Chicago. Can't quite remember where Saggs was at, but they both came, obviously with a bit of an Orientalist lens, as we've spoken about, especially Olmsted, I think, more than Saggs. one thing that's important with them is their work, we can say, is valuable for sure. There's no reason to pretend and say we need to discard the work of these people. I know in the question that you had asked over email to me was, do we need to value these works still as Assyrians? Essentially, was where it boils down to, and they did good work in Assyriology. They certainly, Saggs especially, took a different view and sort of transformed how we want to view Assyria as a bit of a for its achievements, for what it represented in its time, the power, the might. While Olmstead, we could say, sort of took a more traditionalist view to it, and saying that we need to look at it and talk about its rise and its fall, just as every empire. Sort of reminded me of a way like Edward Gibbon kind of wrote his Roman Empire, except Olmstead is writing this about Assyria. I think Saggs's work especially is important to us to kind of analyze the beginning of academia kind of shifting in its view in Assyria, and viewing it not just as a biblical lens, as Sarah was kind of pointing it out, but viewing it from a historical and archaeological lens. What can we learn from this culture? What did this culture truly have to offer society? Obviously, Assyriology has expanded immensely since their time, in terms of what we've discovered, what we've learned, different advancements the Assyrian Empire had. So their work can be expanded upon. It's not gospel. It's not by any means something we need to throw away, but it is something valuable to look at how the study of Assyriology was changing, how mindsets were shifting. I mean, obviously, we've looked at some modern authors that have unfortunately reverted back to very old and stupid tropes regarding Assyriology. But I think with Saggs, there's a lot of positivity, considering the time he was writing. So I think these are important works. I think these are, as Assyrians, if we want to be educated on ancient Assyria, I think sometimes we can look at their works and learn plenty of things. Personally, that's what I would likely say.
That's great. Both of you. Sarah, I don't know if you were, your voice was choppy because you were in awe of the greatness of Olmstead and Saggs, or whether it was just a technical issue. Let's hear you now. Let me just hear.
Hello. Do I sound clear?
Now you sound clear. Yes.
Okay.
Well,
Yeah, go.
sorry. Go ahead. Back to that earlier question. Just kind of give me like a summary.
Well, I mean, I feel like
it's quite choppy again.
Okay, it's
Yeah.
okay. We can see, I can put it in writing if anything.
Okay. Let me just suggest to both of you that these two men, though dead, I think should be resurrected intellectually by Assyrians, because they really helped play an important part in understanding Assyria from the sources of the Assyrians themselves. So, Sarah, one of the things that you said was, it lacked the voices of Assyrians. Now, did it lack the voice of the ordinary Assyrian? Yes. And certainly that's an issue, because we haven't yet discovered sort of the voices of the ordinary Assyrians. Most of what we have are the elites among the Assyrians speaking to us in ancient cuneiform and then later Aramaic writings. But these two individuals deserve to be remembered because their contributions to Assyrian history is, I think, momentous. Why? We're going to go over some of the main points. They're not moralistic like the authors early on, like Sayce and Rollinson and others, even Laird. They're not judgmental in their writings against the Assyrians, but they really, truly try to understand. And we're going to have some interesting quotes from both of these authors in their tremendous works, really. And let's begin with Olmstead. His work, which is available at the Ashurbanipal Library, is History of Assyria. I would say comprehensive history that tries to, for the first time, build a theme of a powerful empire. I'm also going to kind of critique it towards the end once we hear what he has to say. There's a review of it, a valuable and comprehensive work. Indeed, it was a very comprehensive work written with a commanding grasp of the historical flow, though at times more vivid than precise in detail, meaning Olmstead paints a picture for us. He talks about the Assyrian kings going on their campaigns. He talks about Assyrians worshiping. He tries to make the Assyrian a human being. And in his storytelling, perhaps this is what the critique is, that maybe it should have been a little more detailed, although I would certainly disagree. I would say the book is extremely detailed, citing many sources. Now, people have critiqued Olmstead for, here's a picture, a rare picture of Olmstead. People have critiqued him for kind of being what we call an Orientalist, but I would like to show you some of his writings and truly dig deeper into his thinking and understand what he was saying about Assyria. And I think in the end, you will come away with a much more refined and perhaps nuanced picture of who this man was. He was a professor at the University of Chicago. And the University of Chicago, where we are here, is a very important place for the study of Assyrian history. It's got the Oriental Institute, which is now it's called ISAC, Institute for Study of Ancient Cultures. And it is a place where Assyrian ruins are kept, mostly from the city of Dur Sharukin. And it is the place where the Assyrian dictionary was worked on for close to 100 years. By the way, Assyrian organizations altogether came and gave a lot of the scholars headed by Martha Roth, all these Assyriologists who worked on the Assyrian dictionary. It was an incredible work, over 20 volumes, which I believe we have at the Ashurbanipal Library. Correct, Sarah?
Mhm.
Okay, good, good. All the volumes, right? Okay.
You know, Robbie, she might not be able to answer considering the state of her internet. So maybe it'll be better for her to type the answer if you
Okay.
ask
Okay.
the
Yeah.
question.
Just chat with me on the chat. Okay. Well, we have these volumes, and these volumes are just incredible, incredible work for over 100 years. Different scholars working from the 20s for close to 100 years on this dictionary. So this is the University of Chicago, a very important place for the study of ancient Assyrian history. Now, his name was Albert ten Eyck Olmstead, better known as A.T. Olmstead. Lived a short, I would say, a short life, given that I'm getting close to what he was when he passed away, 65. Poor guy. All right, so what makes Olmstead different than the other people who wrote about Assyria? Now, remember, bring to your mind people like Rollinson, and I will refer to them again, but bring to mind Sayce and Rollinson and Laird and how judgmental they were in coming to judge the Assyrians for being a warlike, a savage people, so on and so forth. We've quoted many people and how they've led to so many others writing publicly and popularly about the Assyrians being a very cruel people and being compared to, for example, and contrasted with the Persians as being a much more benign people, or Babylonians. I gave you some quotes in the last lecture where we talked about how Sayce understood the Babylonians as a different people and understood them to be nice farmers, whereas the Assyrians I think you referred to them, of a more pure race, being a more warlike people and constantly looking for trouble, and their God was a war God versus the peaceful God of the others, so on and so forth. Now, some of this may come from the Old Testament, but others Really, it was sort of stereotypical Orientalism. So he used original sources, Olmstead did, unlike many of his predecessors. He knew the Akkadian language well, and he focused on the correspondence, whereas others, George Rollinson, others relied primarily on biblical text and classical authors and secondhand translations. Olmsted instead looked at the original sources, at the primary sources. Olmsted wrote a narrative of Assyria. It was the first time that we saw, this is over 100 years ago, a comprehensive history of the entire state of Assyria before its fall. And this is a nice narrative, a historical narrative, rather than an antiquarian description, whereas before many people would cite the text, they would translate the text and just kind of give us what people said and then cast judgment on how cruel and ruthless and savage the ancient Assyrians were. And look at this, what the king is saying. Rather than treating Assyria as a static and exotic object of archaeological fascination, Olmsted wrote a continuous political cultural history. And this is where sometimes the critique comes in of not being as precise as necessary. He treated Assyria not merely as a source of monuments or biblical footnote, but as a living empire. And he said Assyrians should be studied for themselves and by themselves. He had a critical view towards these sources. He didn't just, despite some people thinking that he just regurgitated a lot of these and said, this is what the king said, and we have to kind of believe him. No, he actually critiqued many of these and he contextualized them. And he had a humanistic approach to the study of Assyria. He gave us vivid portrayals of kings like Ashurbanipal or Tiglath-Pileser, and these are very beautiful narratives to still read today, almost reading like a novel. And he's weaving together based on the text what he has, and then kind of filling in the gaps at times. He understood context, and this is very important, whereas others didn't. He compared Assyrians not through a moralistic lens, but he compared Assyrians to other cultures and other peoples. And though he acknowledged that the Assyrians were very violent at times, well, he said, you know, this was the way the world was. And by the way the world is. Remember, he's writing after the end of the First World War period. So he has in mind the devastation caused by the First World War. And he's not oblivious, as other writers in, say, the 1800s were, to violence in our age. And he tells us at the beginning, this is a quote from him, yet at the very beginning, a warning should be uttered. The Assyrian was frankly and honestly an imperialist. Now, by imperialism, we mean a nation which conquers other nations, basically. And there was bloodshed and cruelty in his warfare, as there is in others. And he did not understand why he should not relate what he did. So this is a critique of many people, authors, who say, well, look at how cruel the Assyrians were. And his attitude is to defend the Assyrians, to say, well, why shouldn't these people who are imperialists, like any other imperialists, retell their story? So he's saying these very vivid accounts, you know, that we read oftentimes, written by, in particular, Ashurnasirpal II or Sarhaddin or Ashurbanipal, these vividly violent stories of having to punish people who have committed wrongs against the Assyrians or against the king. Why should they tell these stories? Why should they gloat in this type of victory and this violence? And in his view, why shouldn't they tell them? And he says the present writer believes the truth should be told about war and none of his evil doings concealed. So he's with the Assyrians. And by the way, I want to tell you a little story. When I was at the place where he taught, the University of Chicago, many years ago, there was a curator who walked around the museum showing the Egyptian section and the Assyrian section. And I'm telling you this because this has had a very strong influence on the way curators and other people who tell a popular history view Assyrian history and view the Assyrians as a whole, not just the kings, not just the warriors. And so she went around and she talked about the Egyptians, said a whole bunch of things about the mummies and King Tut and so on. When it came to the Assyrian section, she talked, I would say, about half an hour or so about the Egyptian reliefs and ruins and the mummies. When it came to the Assyrian section, basically all she could muster up was that these people were very cruel. And you see, the beheadings that they commit, and there happens to be a sort of a primitive relief where there are beheading. She didn't talk anything about the Assyrian winged bull, didn't say anything about the sculptures of officials in Dur Sharokin, which are some of the rare finds of the University of Chicago. But she did talk about the beheadings. And when I approached her, her attitude was, well, they were very cruel and they were showing it. And I asked if showing something, and I hadn't read this passage then, this is many, many years ago. If showing something makes you crueler, then hiding something makes you kind. Is this the position that you take? And so here, Olmstead is answering us, and he's saying the present writer believes the truth should be told about war. Again, remember, he's coming after the First World War, and none of his, meaning war's, evil doings be concealed. So as far as the Assyrians were concerned, well, let them show what war is. Let them show their victories and their violence, because they're essentially telling the truth about their imperialist ambitions. Now, then he goes over, particularly in this chapter, which is a very, very important chapter. In fact, if you read nothing of the entire work of Olmstead, which is very, very important itself because it tells the whole story of Assyria from beginning to its kings, to the formation of empire, to its fall, you should read the chapter entitled The Assyrian Wolf at the end. And here he quotes De Morgan, who's a noted, who was actually, he was an engineer and a geologist and also an archaeologist, a French noted Orientalist. He says about him, about his writing, in our maturity, we open the pages of a book of a distinguished Orientalist. This is De Morgan. And he says that Assyria was the nest of the bird of prey whence, during nearly 10 centuries. Now, he's writing originally in the French. This is a translation, just so you know. Set forth the most terrible expeditions which have ever flooded the world with blood. Ashur was its god, plunder its morality, material pleasure its ideal, cruelty and terror its means. No people was ever more abject than those of Ashur. No sovereigns were ever more despotic, more covetous, more vindictive, more pitiless, more proud of their crimes. Of their crimes. Assyria sums up in itself all the vices. Aside from bravery, courage, it offers not a single virtue. One must leave over periods, the whole of the world's history, to find here and there, in the most troubled periods, public crimes whose frightfulness may be compared with the horrors of daily committed by the men of Nineveh in the name of their God. The Assyrian is not an artist, not a man of literature, not a lawgiver. He is a parasite, basing his organization of pillage on a formidable military power. As far as he extended his empire, he ruled, but he did not govern. His appetites were without limit. In him is incarnate to the highest degree, here comes the Orientalism, the defects and vices of Asiatic political systems. All right, so who is the Assyrian? He was a parasite. So now what does Olmstead? Now Olmstead reads this because this was, remember, this was the lingua franca of the day. This is the way to think about the Assyrians during his day. And so he tells us what we have read is a triumph of the rhetorical art, but does it represent the sober verdict of history? No sovereign was ever more pitiless. It seems hardly possible that the author of the statement had ever read Assyrian annals. Example after example may be cited. Remember, Olmstead read the original writings of the Assyrians. So it tells us example after example may be cited from the preceding pages where enemies, nay, even rebels, were forgiven, were granted rings and clothes of honor, their gods were repaired and restored, their territory increased. So he's telling this Orientalist, De Morgan, you've got it wrong, because if you read the sources, the Assyrian is not what you think he is. He is, in fact, showing you example after example. Even kings are telling you that they've forgiven rebels, people who rebelled against Assyria. Now, there were, of course, other times when people were punished, but there are many examples, example after example of the material that Olmstead read, whereas De Morgan, Rollinson, and others did not read. The Assyrian was cruel. This is something that De Morgan is saying. The Assyrian was cruel. So he was, Olmstead retorts, but it is something more than rhetorical question when we inquire into whether he was more cruel than others have been in times past or present. For example, he cut off heads, while the Egyptians preferred hands or phalloi, and our own Indian scalps. Now, to the right, I have images for you of Europeans in love with showing how people can be beheaded. You know, it's the story of David, it's the story of Judith, so on and so forth. Hundreds of these paintings. You can see them in the great museums of Europe and the United States, and there's nothing unusual about them. But he tells us, you know, the English came near the Assyrian custom with their rotting heads of traitors spiked on the Tower Gate in London, which I've seen, by the way, and this was redone by an artist for a rather comical effect. But can you imagine the Tower of London containing heads long after they became Christian, of course? Where the Assyrian impaled, the Roman crucified, the Englishman quartered and drew. And if you don't know what quartering and drawing is, look it up after we're done. If the Assyrians burned youth and maidens in the fire, for each recorded example of the Assyrian annals, we can literally give 1,000 cases of witches, another 1,000 of heretics burned by Christian orders. So he's really going after the Western mind that looks at Assyria from this perspective. War is, after all, nothing but war, he says, a reversion to savagery. There is not an Assyrian atrocity which has not its parallel or its equivalent in the civilized history of the last 100 years. We may, with perfect justice, condemn war and its cause, imperialism. As a warrior and an imperialist, the Assyrian was no better and no worse than his present-day descendants. Again,
and you know what?
sorry, let me make this point. Sorry. So again, remember, he's coming after the First World War. What happened during the First World War? You know, the genocide of the Armenians and the Assyrians. I mean, so much happened during these times, the atrocities, all of the deaths that came. So to condemn the Assyrian is completely being removed from the proper historical context. Go ahead, Pierre. Sorry.
No worries. I think this is great, especially when we had certain questions kind of leading up to this point in the other classes, in which how can historians paint a double standard between their own times and even modern history and what the Assyrians did, when they can sit and condemn the Assyrians for being imperialist, but they can't look at their own times and condemn themselves for it. Now, this is what Olmstead is doing a great job of. Olmstead is looking at his present reality, like you said, the horrors of the Great War, or even what the British did, or even how he mentions the Americans taking Indian scalps, for example. He's contrasting this and saying, we can sit and applaud this in its time, or say this is accepted now, but when the Assyrians did it, it's a problem. And we made this point many, many times in the other classes. It's frankly ridiculous to paint this double standard, whether it's today or at any point. When we see war crimes being committed today, there will be people who will excuse them. And in the same way, Olmstead is saying, you can't sit and condemn the Assyrians. We need to condemn war as a whole. But war is a natural human phenomenon, as we brought up in a previous class when I said John Mearsheimer, who's a renowned political scientist, when he talks about states act as human beings, they act to preserve themselves. And violence and the monopoly of violence is something that these states, in every state in history, has sought to have. So to sit and condemn Assyrians as violent, as we brought up in other classes, is frankly ridiculous. And I'm glad that Olmstead is able to point out that this is just a silly concept.
See, and I mean, and this is coming in the 1920s, so a long time ago. You have an intellectual that we have to respect. Not that he's saying Assyrians are not violent. He certainly is saying, hey, they had their share of cruelty, but he's not saying, as one particular author, which we are going to get into, much more modern scholar, Eckhart Fromm, is saying in a passage, we've got to tell the darker side of the Assyrians. Let's not forget that. And my attitude is, there's a darker side to every human imperial enterprise, every single one. And as you pointed out, John Mearsheimer is a very good one to say, look, an empire is ruthless. And he was talking in the context of the United States. An empire can be very ruthless. And the same with Russian Empire, the same with the Chinese, and so on and so forth. When you get in the way of empire, you better be prepared for violence. And so this is the international system, unfortunately, that we live in. So he ends by saying this. I think this is very important. This is the view that he takes towards the Assyrians, because in particular, one thing that haunts Assyrian history, it's like a ghost that won't go away, is the accusation of cruelty and barbarity. Okay, no matter that we have this man writing 100 years ago, still we are stuck with this. If you do a search on Google, you will get it. But he tells us what must be the final verdict of history. He asks, as his epitaph, we must write, at his epitaph, we must write, in him is incarnate. Should we write this in the highest degree, the defects and vices of Asiatic political systems, but the more charitable, more sympathetic, more historically just epitaph should be, the Assyrian was a human being. Being such, he was very much like ourselves. So we're kind of looking into the mirror of history. He was sometimes good and sometimes bad. He was cruel and he was forgiving. He was wise and then he blundered. He had capabilities for certain work. He had none for others. All in all, he was a man, and a capable man. He suffered the usual human limitations. He was a child of his age. The empire he founded marked a milestone in the long and heartbreaking advance towards a higher civilization. So he's very Hegelian in this way, that people build towards a higher civilization. Some disagree with this. He was the shepherd dog of civilization, and he died at his post. Such an epitaph is sadly lacking in the rhetorical art, but it is the sober truth of history. So what he's saying is, Assyrians protected civilization from more barbaric forces that threatened to destroy civilization. And the way he was thinking is, knowing history, there were all these nomadic forces around the Assyrians, like the Medes and Cimmerians or Cimmerians and Scythians and others, and from the Arabian Peninsula and other nomadic peoples. And the Assyrians protected cities, protected civilization. And the Assyrian, one could say, was kind of the shepherd dog of civilization, protecting it. And our good friend, Dr. Alexander Edmonds, has written a book, which we will also discuss in the near future. It is much more focused on a segment of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Having had a discussion with him today about Olmstead and Saggs, we both agreed that these two authors are very, very important in understanding Assyrian history and represent a new page in the study of Assyrian history. Olmstead seems, he tells us, to be the first Assyriologist to attempt a more thematic approach to the Assyrian expansion in various contemporaneous articles, and he cites them. And he does say, while still prone to recapitulating the contents of Assyrian annals in extenso, meaning in their fullness, well, you can't blame, this was the first time, you can't blame Olmstead for citing all of these sources, but I believe he contextualized them properly. And he does say in many of his writings that, look, the Assyrians wrote this stuff to kind of frighten people into not rebelling. So to prevent them from rebelling, this was information that they put out there. So in summary, if we talk about Olmstead, this was a turning point in Assyrian history. It was a groundbreaking Assyrian history in primary sources, based on primary sources, writing a narrative of human agency and imperial development, interpreting texts critically, not simply following what has been said, and abandoning the heavily moralistic Orientalist views of earlier generations. This work laid the groundwork for modern Assyriology and influenced how Near Eastern history would be written in the rest of the 20th century. So very, very important work. If you have not read this work, please do read the chapter, the last chapter, Assyrian Wolf, in quote marks, of course, because here he's talking about what Lord Byron said, the Assyrian came down like the wolf on the fold, representing the Assyrian as an animal of prey. Well, that's Olmstead. What about Henry Saggs? Henry Saggs is also a very, very important author for Assyrian studies. He wrote The Might That Was Assyria, among other books. He also writes about Babylon. Saggs, for the first time, again, narrates new findings of Assyrian kings, tells the story that has been repeated since then. And many of the works coming after Saggs follow Saggs. Now, this was 50 years after the work of Olmstead, but Saggs also represents to us a very important look at the Assyrian Empire. He tells the story, he begins with Geography of Assyria, tells us what's unique about Assyria, this particular landscape centered among the foothills of northern Iraq, or the Zagros Mountains and the Mesopotamian plains. He tells us of the rise of the empire until its fall. He tells us that the Assyrian Empire began with Shemshi-Edet in 1813, although that's not really the formal empire. Major cities of Ashur, Nineveh, Arbela, and Arafqa, or Kirkuk, modern-day Kirkuk, were formally united into one kingdom of Assyria. This is when the power of Assyria grows, when we begin to see Assyria as more than just a city-state of Ashur. Administrative efficiency and political skill are attributed to Shemshi-Edet, formed alliances with various princes, and he tells us, I installed my governors everywhere. And this leads to the creation of what we came to know as Assyria. So this is about 2000 BC. And then the Assyrian Empire grows to what Saggs gives us is this rough map of the Assyrian Empire, which really is in control of the entire Near East and including Egypt all the way down to Thebes towards the end of the empire. But it also had influence in Cyprus. In fact, if you're not sure, Cyprus contained a sculpture of King Sargon II. So Assyrians definitely reached Cyprus and many other places where the Ionians were, okay, which we interpret as Ionai, or the Greeks. Now, when does the Assyrian kingdom really form into what one can call an empire? He attributes Ashur-uballit as being the very first king. He tells us that Ashur-uballit, to this king can be traced the strong kings of Assyria. Before the time of Ashur-uballit, the Assyrian king was often referred to as the servant of, or the representative of Ashur, not really as king. Ashur was king. Ashur, the god of the superior god, kind of the Zeus of the Assyrian pantheon, was the king of Assyria, and the king of Assyria, or the governor of Assyria, was his representative. So we can trace back the formation of this conquering state, of this imperial enterprise, according to Saggs, to the empire of Ashur-uballit I. Now remember, the very last king of Assyria, and some call him the prince of Assyria because he took the throne after the fall of the city of Ashur, where all of the Assyrian kings had to be consecrated as kings, or sharu, in the temple of Ashur. So the city of Ashur was destroyed by this time. The very last king of Assyria, or last prince, as many say, is Ashur-uballit II, or as some will say, Ashur-uballit III. That's the very last king in 609 BC, when the destruction of Haran takes place. That's the second, or the last capital of the Assyrian Empire. Well, but long before that, the Assyrian imperial enterprise went on, according to Saggs, and he tells us of Tiglath-Pileser roaming around in Anatolia and putting his image, and there you have an image. And there's a recently discovered image in the heartland of Turkey right now of Tiglath-Pileser I. Now we're going back over 1,000 years BC, 1,100 years BC, to Tiglath-Pileser I. By the way, one of the professors writing recently, which the foundation supported to produce his book online, was Dr. Alexander Edmonds. He feels that Tiglath-Pileser III should be the fourth because there's an additional Tiglath-Pileser. But for now, let's stick with these numbers. So the imperial prime of the Assyrian Empire comes at the time of Tiglath-Pileser III. And this reign is a very important reign, according to Saggs, and he tells us this is from 745 to 727. He introduced the greatest century of expansion of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire went to twice its size. What was so unusual about him is that there was a dramatic change in the international situation, followed by major imperial reorganization, administrative reorganization, which gave the king direct and almost immediate control over all the resources of his empire through the governors of the state. They were now split up and manned by a hierarchy of officials appointed by and directly responsible to the king at the capital. And at this time, it was Nimrut, or Kalhu. A rapid and efficient communication system of network of posting stages, afterwards taken over by the Persians. Remember, the Persians take often credit, or the Achaemenids take credit for forming the first postal system in the world. Not true. Saggs tells us they get credit for devising it, but it was really the Assyrians. The king had also his personal traveling inspectors to investigate the performance of provincial officials. So he was inspecting their performances. And he was forming alliances. In addition to engaging in violent warfare, he was forming alliances. Again, in the Bible, we see how Ahaz of Judah, when threatened by a hostile coalition, appealed not in vain to his overlord, Tiglath-Pileser. The kingdom of Judah is appealing to Tiglath-Pileser III, saying, please help us. An intelligence system was also built up. So what does that tell you? Keep in mind the writings of De Morgan and others who were critiqued by Olmstead, who felt that Assyria was just about brute power and nothing else. Well, here you see a very intricate network. As the closer you look to the Assyrian Empire, the more sophisticated it becomes. And from this time, Saggs tells us it's abundant. There's abundant evidence of Urartian spies in the Assyrian pay, meaning the Assyrians were using a very sophisticated intelligence system. We have mention of their reports in some cases, and it is not unreasonable to assume that this was not limited to Urartu. So it seems that there was an Assyrian intelligence service. Now, what it was called, Central Intelligence Agency of Assyria, CIAA perhaps, one doesn't know, but we know the system was there, along with a very efficient communication system. So this marked the high point of the Assyrian Empire. And after this, we continue to build, but this is really a very significant period. And Saggs makes this very clear. And he gives us a text by one of the governors that Tiglath-Pileser is ruling over, who is not an Assyrian, who is in the area of Syria, Sam'al to be precise. He says this: "My father grasped at the hem of his lord, the great king of Assyria. Then did he live, and Yadi, the name of the kingdom of Sam'al, lived. My father ran at the wheel of his lord Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, in campaigns from east to west. My father died at the feet of his lord Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, on campaign, and all the camp of his lord and the king of Assyria wept for him. And his lord, the king of Assyria, erected an image of him by the roadside and brought my father across from Damascus, where he had died. Then, because of my father's loyalty and my own loyalty, my lord Tiglath-Pileser set me on the throne." So, yes, this is an unusual relationship, of course, one of an overlord, but you don't sense what many of the writers have said, that Assyrians ruled merely by brutality and fear and terror. This certainly really breaks that mold that has been constructed by these moralist and Orientalist authors apart. Now, Eckhart Fromm makes an interesting point. He basically copies or repeats what Saggs has said about Tiglath-Pileser III. And he said it cannot be denied that the beginning of the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, perhaps soon to be the fourth, soon, as scholars debate that, Assyrian statehood possessed many of the hallmarks of empire: a powerful center represented by a strong king, complex, wide-ranging provincial system, well-equipped army, all the things that Saggs says. But whereas Saggs attributes the foundation of the Assyrian Empire to a much earlier time, Fromm, for reasons that will become clear later on, tells us that Assyria seems to fall short in chronological terms. It ruled most of Western Asia for no more than 120 years. The Achaemenid Empire, not to speak of the Roman or the British Empire, lasted much longer. I think he's wrong, but not a matter of debating Eckhart Fromm right now. But between Ashur-uballit I and Tiglath-Pileser III, we have 35 Assyrian kings, many of whom were very active Assyrian kings. Now, Assyria went through periods of decline. There were plagues, there were difficulties, diseases sometimes, weather issues, so on and so forth. But all of these kings came between Ashur-uballit I, 1363 to 1328, and Tiglath-Pileser III, who came after Ashur-nirari V. So is it fair to dismiss this entire period? I don't think so. And so if you take everything into account, really the Assyrian Empire lasted, I do a comparison here, the duration is much longer than many of the empires that came afterwards, including the Western Roman Empire. Now, the Eastern Roman Empire, different story, slightly more complicated. But you see here the Parthians ruled for about 471 years. And there's even questions about their rule because we just don't find much in terms of Parthian rule in a lot of Assyrian cities. The Sasanians, 427 years. The Seleucids, 249, and the Achaemenids, which are mentioned by Eckhard Fromm, is ruling much longer, 220 years. So in comparison, you see the duration of the Assyrian Empire. Certainly a powerful Assyrian state with imperial ambitions, much, much longer than many of the others. So what does this tell you? This is not just about the timeline. It's about the impact this empire has had. And you don't have to listen to me. You can listen to the archaeologists constantly digging up more and more as they go through the ruins of Assyria. And this is a golden age right now as we speak, of Assyrian archaeology in the various cities of Assyria. So Saggs tells us that Assyrians showed genius in empire building. The Assyrians showed this genius through their control, not just brute force, but over a vast area. Remember the critique of that one Orientalist who said they conquered, but they didn't govern? Well, that's not what Saggs says. In looking carefully at the sources, we see a state having an imperial system that was sophisticated, and he emphasized their success due not solely to military might, but their ability to manage logistics, infrastructure, multi-ethnic governance effectively, and also a intelligence system that we talked about. On the contributions to civilizations, he says they weren't merely destroyers. Their liberties, in their libraries, engineering works, and international diplomacy demonstrate a civilization that was deeply engaged with the world and capable of great achievements. There are, by the way, a number of articles on the Assyrians venturing into the deep Mediterranean towards the west and having contacts with other peoples in the Mediterranean, including all the way to Iberia. There's this question. I think that's still in a work in study. Assyrians were more thorough in recording. So that's one of the things that even Olmstead says and others say, that Assyrian harshness towards their enemies came in large part from them being able to record a lot of the details. And this not only was in Assyrian literature, but it was also in Assyrian art. Very few kingdoms in the Near East during this time show the kind of narrative art that we have, whether it's lion hunting during the time of Ashurbanipal, or the wars that were waged during Ashurbanipal, Sarhaddon, Sennacherib, or Sargon. Many of these kingdoms do not show this very detailed narrative art that Assyrians have. And they also have much less in terms of correspondence and archival records, whereas the Assyrians have a lot. I mean, King Sargon II alone has over 1,000 correspondence, many of which have not been translated yet. Assyrian power stemmed from Ashur. Remember, one of the critiques was kind of it had a biblical foundation, that the Assyrians never gave credit to God, while the Assyrians felt that their power, their kingdom, their imperial might, their ingenuity, their abilities, their will, all came from the gods. And the supreme head was, of course, Ashur. Assyrians were, according to Saggs, sophisticated in their religion. So he insists on this, that there was an intellectual dimension of Assyrian religion, countering dismissive views that it was primitive or merely magical. That's not the case, according to Saggs. And he tells us that the great gods were everywhere, meaning they weren't just in the temples, and that we have such statements about the gods as this: he wears the heavens on his head like a turban. He is shot with the underworld as with sandals. He is in the underworld with sandals. But just as in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the particular place associated with encounter with God or the divine is the synagogue, the church, or the mosque, so in ancient Assyria, it was particularly the temple where the gods were to be approached. Where do you go when you pray? You go to the church. Where does a Muslim go when he goes to pray? A mosque. Are there holy places in all of these religions? Every single one. The temples were as old as the cities themselves at first settlement. The original settlers would have provided a dwelling, originally quite small, for the god who incorporated their group identity. The god would come to have his family and household staff, just like a human ruler. Here he's speculating, of course, represented by subsidiary deities with chapels or shrines attached to the building of the main deity, so on and so forth, until we build a city. So this is kind of the beginning of the Assyrian faith. He also tells us one more thing, which is very important, unlike many of the authors up until this time. He tells us that, remember when we talked about Xenophon, who was a Greek mercenary who came to help the king of Persia regain his power against a rival. Xenophon looked at Assyrian ruins and really saw very little or saw nothing. And Saggs looks back at this time and tells us, had Xenophon been in the area of Kelha or Kelhu is Nimrud, and Nineveh in more favorable circumstances, he might have learned the identity of these ruins from local inhabitants. The destruction of the Assyrian Empire did not wipe out its population, contrary to many of the people who wrote during this time, almost up until this time. They were predominantly peasant farmers, and since Assyria contains some of the best wheat land in the Near East, descendants of the Assyrian peasants would, as opportunity permitted, build new villages over the old cities and carry on with agricultural life, remembering traditions of the former cities. After 7 or 8 centuries and various vicissitudes, these people become Christians and not only kept alive the memory of the sites of their Assyrian predecessors, but also combined them with traditions from the Bible. And of course, he's absolutely right. We know the story of Marqardach, and we know the story of Marbehnam and Sara, and all of these contain Assyrian themes that were preserved by the Assyrians and kind of came together with their Christian faith. So he does compare Ashur to Yahweh, and I don't want to go into this too much, but just to say he has a great deal of respect for the development of Assyrian religion. But more importantly, Saggs differs from his predecessors, in particular, George Rollinson and Archibald Sayce. And I don't want to set them up as straw men, but the way that he looked at Assyrian history is very different from these earlier authors, okay? And I'm not sure if you can see the image of, I'm going to move this so you can see the image of the evangelist George Rollinson, who's the brother of Henry Rawlinson. So he looked at Assyrian history from a strictly evangelical Christian, imperialist, moralist, and I would say even Orientalist view. And Sayce also Christian apologetics, early philology. So he did study some Assyrian records, but did not contextualize them properly, whereas Saggs looked at them from a more scholarly, secular, even if not fully secular, certainly with scholarly objectivity. So how does he hold up to his predecessors? Assyria's character, Rollinson and Sayce tell us it was morally degenerate, it was violent. He tells us it was complex, it was strategic, it was culturally rich. The role of religion, seen as simple idolatry, Sardanet Khempe, I'm sorry. This was also, these writings, by the way, I have to tell you, have also impacted Assyrians, and that's partly why I asked earlier Sarah and Pierre how they would write differently, and maybe it was an unfair question the way it was categorized, but we have to know that Assyrians were impacted by people such as Rollinson and Sayce talking about their history. They would say, our ancestors were morally degenerate, they were violent, they were bad. In the Assyrian language. So Saggs studied history as an integral part of a political life. The scholarly objective was different. Sayce and Rollinson, for example, they confirm the Bible and warn people about morality. And what Saggs is telling us, and also Olmstead, I would say before him, is, look, we have to understand contextuality and we have to understand history. Legacy perspective, Assyria was justly destroyed according to the earlier authors. And Saggs tells us, look, you misunderstood and undervalued this Assyria, this nation. So where do they fall short? And I want to conclude by just allowing you to think about this a little bit, because this is the kind of discussion I have with some of the scholars who study and draw these lines. Both authors, as others, of course, draw a disciplined line according to their area of focus and timeline to disconnect Assyria's long history into segments. Now, you might say, well, of course, you have to study ancient history by itself, and you've got to study ancient Assyrian history up until the time of the fall of the empire. And I want to ask you, and not necessarily have you answer me now, but just put it in your mind, why should this be the dividing line? There is a fall of a kingdom, but the people are not destroyed, and they're still living in these areas. Certainly that can mark an important milestone, but it shouldn't disrupt the continuity of these people. We're often told by other authors, Iranian history continued, but Assyrian history was ended with the fall of the Assyrian Empire. And so I think it's very unhealthy. And although Saggs reaches out a little bit, it's a little bit meager when he talks about Assyrian farmers, but there's a much bigger story to be told there. And we at the Assyrian Cultural Foundation are on the lookout for scholars, and we are coming across people who have studied the development of the Assyrian people long after the fall of the empire. And we hope that these scholars will come forward and give lectures, and we are encouraging that. Assyria, it is noted, came into being by building a union out of the fragments of Ashur, Nineveh, Arbela, Haran, and other cities. And this is true. The Assyrians formed a system which united all of these cities and formed a strong network, and later, of course, built this into an empire. After the fall of the empire and state, these fragmented again into cities such as Ashur, Hatra, Adiaban, and Nisibis, and others. So there is continuity of language, culture, demography, geography, and yet this seems lost to many historians, oftentimes because the story must end with the fall of Assyria. And what we're saying, and what we have been saying in all of these classes, is it should not end with the fall of Assyria. The Assyrian people did not end, despite the statements and the writings of certain scholars, which are being challenged and were challenged years ago and shown to be wrong. And the Assyrian people continued on. And so this is a very important topic to discuss, whether scholars should end their studies and say, for example, this is a fragmented history. We have the ancient Assyrians, and we have Syriac civilization, and we have modern Assyrians. And these three are separate things, and they have no connection to each other. So we say, no, they do have a connection with each other. There is, of course, disruption. There is transformation, but there is certainly continuity of the Assyrian people throughout the ages.